I used to think betrayal was a clean break, a knife that entered once and left you bleeding on the kitchen tile. The truth was messier, quiet as a shadow, patient as rust, spreading through the small corners of my life until everything I trusted tasted like metal. The doctor's office smelled like antiseptic and paper gowns. The test results were a handful of syllables that didn't fit in my mouth. I walked out into the hard noon, and the city kept breathing, indifferent. Somewhere between the curb and the crosswalk, I decided to vanish. I grew up in a neighborhood where silence could be a skill. You learned to read the weather of a room, to notice the extra squad car idling at the corner, the clerk's watchful eyes, the way teachers called your name only when they needed a lesson to carry weight. My mother taught me patience the way her mother taught her, measured breaths, folded laundry, the long ceremonies of making do. My father taught me pride when he could, in between night shifts that turned his knuckles into split chalk and steel. From those streets I learned to walk with my shoulders down and my gaze forward. College came on a scholarship that felt like crossing a border without luggage. I majored in construction management because it had edges and plans and weight that held, a world where measurements mattered and integrity was specified in concrete terms. On site, I controlled chaos and turned drawings into scaffolds that kissed the sky. People shook my hand and said I had the calm to build cathedrals. She arrived in my life at a charity run, sweat bright, sunlit, the kind of beautiful that pulls a crowd's eyes like gravity. We matched strides for 3 miles and traded stories about favorite music, city neighborhoods, and the best place for late-night biryani. She was warmth made visible, all soft laughter and questions that made me feel more interesting than I was. When she chose me, I felt like a house finally getting windows. Our wedding was a small riot of joy, a tidy miracle my family held with careful gratitude. It felt like we were building something steady, a 1-bedroom that smelled of cumin and lemon, a budget spreadsheet taped to the fridge, Sunday evenings spent planning the week like architects. She decorated with thrift store frames and my mother's quilt. The landlord learned my name. The downstairs neighbor learned my footsteps. The barista at the corner shop learned my order and scribbled hearts on the lid when I wore my ring like a brand of belonging. But the city kept its own secrets. A foreman who called me kid, even when my plans saved him thousands. A client who said he loved my professionalism and then asked if my English was self-taught, given where you're from. A police cruiser that crawled next to me for 2 blocks after I left a job site late, lights off, as if I were a rumor that needed chasing. I filed these moments into drawers labeled Not Now. I was busy joining the middle of the story I'd promised myself. When she told me she was pregnant, the future unfolded like fresh blueprints, a crib assembled on a Sunday, the soft thunder of tiny socks in the dryer, a bank account with a line item called college. I took on extra shifts and wore the ache with pride. The first time I felt the baby kick beneath my palm, I understood why some people put their hands together when they have no words left. The world kept turning. The due date floated toward us. Somewhere unseen, the rust kept spreading. The first sign arrived as a joke, a coworker's teasing comment about how the baby might come out with green eyes like the project manager upstairs. Everyone laughed. I folded my smile and put it away. Another sign hid inside a doctor's routine question about family medical history. She stumbled over the details, and I brushed it off as nerves. I didn't want a pattern. I wanted a story that held. We took a childbirth class in a low-lit community center where the floors smelled of gym mats and lemon cleaner. I learned how to swaddle a doll with the gravity of a surgeon. She hummed when she breathed. We practiced for a life I could see in flashes, the midnight feedings, the first tooth, a kindergarten backpack sagging on narrow shoulders. I told myself the unease was just the pressure of becoming a father. I built a toy shelf on Saturday and sanded the edges until they felt like silk. At work, I dealt with a vendor who called me buddy and slid his quotes across the table as if we were trading contraband. He made small talk about the neighborhood where we were building luxury condos and asked if I lived around that side of town. I knew which side he meant. I knew, too, that the new buildings came with patios and guarded smiles and a slow erasure of the people who taught me how to stretch $1. It looked like progress. It tasted like loss. I told myself we were all just trying to make a life that didn't hurt. The test wasn't my idea. It crept in through a story I read about a man who discovered a cruel arithmetic late, after the crib was full and the lullabies were muscle memory. I had never believed in the ritual of proving blood. Love felt bigger than biology. But one evening, after the final appointment before our due date, the narrative, in my head, faltered. She had mentioned a date that didn't line up. She laughed it off, and I tried to follow her cue. Later, sleep wouldn't come. I scrolled through forums that were messy with fear and strangers' advice. A single phrase hooked itself to my chest: "You deserve to know." I arranged the test the way you set aside money for an emergency: practical, shameful, silent. The clinic was all soft lighting and quiet voices. I hated myself for sitting in that waiting room. I hated the way I noticed who else was there: 2 men staring at their shoes, a woman twisting her ring. Everyone breathing like they were hiding from the truth in plain sight. The nurse was clinical kindness, a practiced hush. She handed me pamphlets I didn't read. On the way home, the city seemed to tilt. The mural of children leaping across a brick wall looked like a warning. A billboard promising fairness in hiring felt like a dare. I heard my mother's voice teaching me to keep my cool, to navigate rooms without making waves, to ask the right questions the right way so I could leave intact. I wanted to be the kind of man who trusted the woman he married. I also wanted a life built on bedrock, not stories that shifted underfoot. Days later, the results arrived with the bland finality of a weather report. Against the compression of breath and memory, I clicked open the file. The numbers were simple. The conclusion was not. The baby wasn't mine. There are varieties of silence you don't recognize until you're inside them. There's the silence before a storm. There's the silence of a hospital hallway. And then there's the silence in your own body when your future flickers and goes out, leaving a smell like something electrical burning behind the walls. I stared at the confirmation as if staring could alter its arrangement of letters. I looked for a footnote, a caveat, the kind of fine print that has saved me before. The document stayed polite and unyielding. A single sentence had rearranged the architecture of my life. The toy shelf, the quilt, the crib, the careful accumulation of a father's small devotions, went dim. Love didn't stop. It scattered, became something unlocatable. I imagined telling her. I pictured the living room, the way the evening light pooled near the plants she had coaxed into green. I imagined the conversation spiraling into spaces where apologies behave like smoke. But a different fear arrived, one I knew too well, the fear of becoming a spectacle. I could already hear the quiet judgments, the calibrated sympathies, the blame assigned along invisible lines. I had learned long ago that when something breaks in a family like mine, the world's studies are shards for confirmation of its tired stories. I walked out of the apartment, down the block where the landlord's tulips leaned toward the sun like supplicants, across the intersection where cars braked late and pedestrians ran on faith. The city was an engine of indifference, unbothered by my unraveling. A boy on a scooter zipped past, laughing. An old woman held a bag of oranges like a sacrament. I turned onto streets I didn't usually travel, letting the grid dissolve into alleys and narrow corridors. On the river path, wind scissored the water into shards the color of nickels. I sat on a bench and let memory press its thumb into my ribs. I saw my father rubbing sleep from his eyes before a double shift, heard my mother's quiet arithmetic at the kitchen table. I remembered the officer who once searched me on a pretext and then told me to have a good night, the words sugared and poisonous. I remembered fielding questions at work about whether I was lucky to be here, as if luck were an apology for staying. I had wanted this child not only because I loved the woman who carried it but because parenthood felt like a declaration. I will build a harbor the world cannot breach. The test results snatched the blueprints from my hand and left me holding nothing but a handful of nails. The pain sharpened into a certainty that surprised me. I could not stay and make this a public autopsy. I could not endure being turned into a lesson about who is disposable and who isn't, about whose family is questioned and whose is presumed sacred. I pulled my phone from my pocket and turned it off. No text. No call. No explanation that would tidy this up. The sun slid lower, and the city turned gold the way it does when it's both forgiving and cruel. I stood, felt the weight shift in my body, and understood I had already started disappearing. I thought vanishing meant distance, a measurable geography, the miles between one bus station and the next, the blurred lights on an interstate, the humming anonymity of a city where nobody knows your coffee order. What I learned is that disappearing is a discipline. It's the quiet erasure of routines and markers, the refusal to be found by the same narratives that once convinced you safety was available if you behaved. I left a note that said nothing that could be weaponized. It was a collection of neutral words, the kind that won't bleed if someone drags them across a courtroom, or a living room, or a memory. I packed a small bag, a work shirt, a pair of jeans, the photograph of my parents on their wedding day, my mother's quilt folded into quarters. I took the spare cash from the emergency envelope behind the pantry spices, the one we'd promised to use only when everything went wrong. I locked the door softly, as if the lock had nerves. The first days of disappearing were clumsy. I slept in a motel where the walls were the color of nicotine and the window air conditioner sighed at intervals like a restless animal. I stayed until the manager started recognizing my face, then moved on. I bought a second-hand phone and kept it dark. I took day jobs that paid in cash, hauling drywall scraps into a dumpster, cleaning a greasy kitchen after closing, mixing cement until my shoulders sang their old tired hymn. I learned the names of the neighborhoods where people's lives slid out of the city's official story, where mornings start early and end late, and tomorrow is a puzzle you build each hour. Even in my self-imposed exile, I couldn't avoid the ways injustice threads through daily architecture. At one job, I watched a manager joke that people like me were built for this, as if my body's capacity to endure was an entertainment. At another, a customer refused to hand me his credit card, looking around for someone in charge. Each time I swallowed the heat and moved through it. Disappearing means you do not give strangers the performance they expect. It also means you recognize what survival requires and what it steals. At night, I walked the edges of new block maps, found the parks where sprinklers hiss like snakes, the churches that smelled of wood polish and mercy, the late-night diners where waitresses with tired smiles kept pouring coffee because they understand that sometimes warmth is the only currency that matters. I kept the photograph of my parents on the motel dresser and traced my father's suit lapel, my mother's simple bouquet. They had built a life by choosing each other every morning across a system that did not choose them back. I wanted to honor that kind of choosing, but I also understood that staying had a cost my pride couldn't pay. People will argue that blood matters, that love must bend around it like a river around a rock. I will not pretend I didn't love what we built. I will not pretend that love vanished the moment the test result arrived. What disappeared, instead, was the fiction that I could survive every kind of betrayal without losing something essential. I could have stayed and performed forgiveness for an audience that would have applauded itself for believing in redemption when the price was almost exclusively mine. I could have stayed and become a guardian to a child whose first story about me would have been sacrifice flavored with suspicion. I could have stayed and taught that child a dangerous lesson, that some people's stability is negotiable. I mailed a letter to my mother from a post office 3 towns over. I didn't tell her everything. I folded my news into careful phrases about work, about time away, about needing to breathe without permission. I apologized for the worry I knew I was purchasing with my silence. I asked for no rescue and no permission. I told her I loved her the way a church tells its parishioners to go in peace, an instruction and a blessing at once. Months passed. The city where I settled had a train yard that sang at night and a river that kept its own counsel. I found steadier work with a small contractor who didn't ask questions and appreciated clean lines and quiet competence. On Saturdays, I mixed spices the way my mother taught me and cooked enough food to feed a memory. I read more than I spoke. I learned how to walk through a farmer's market without translating every curious stare. I kept my ring in a drawer wrapped in tissue, not as a keepsake but as a reminder that vows can be both true and insufficient. Sometimes I imagine the child who isn't mine, the one who would have known me as a father in all the small ways that matter. I picture first steps across a living room rug, a hand grabbing my finger like a new anchor, the soft weight on my chest during afternoon naps. Love is a stubborn organism. It keeps sprouting in places you didn't intend to cultivate. But love without truth is an architecture that creaks in every storm. I chose to stop pretending the roof could hold. People will also say I punished the wrong person, that a child did not ask to be born into a complicated story. They are right. And yet I know the world we live in, the ease with which certain families are invited to perform gratitude for second chances while others are audited for breathing. I refused to raise a child inside a room where I had been asked to swallow silence, to smooth my own erasure into something palatable. I refused to teach a lesson I would not want learned, that a man who looks like me exists to absorb hurt quietly and call it love. I am not a ghost. I work, I pay cash, I help a neighbor carry his groceries up a crooked stairwell. I show up on time and build things that hold. I move through the city like someone who has chosen to belong to the unremarked spaces where people keep their promises to themselves. I do not expect forgiveness and do not package my choice as heroism. It is a boundary, drawn finally with a hand that does not shake. If there's a takeaway, it is this: justice is not only a courtroom or a headline. It is the daily insistence on being real in a world that keeps trying to tell you what shape your soul should make. Betrayal can sound like a single sentence delivered in a clinic, but it also sounds like the chorus of smaller cuts that told you, your whole life, to accept what others wouldn't. I will not accept what unravels me. So I ask you, what story are you building, and what secret rust is eating at its beams? And when the day comes that the foundation trembles, will you choose the familiar pain that keeps the house standing for other people's comfort, or the honest emptiness from which you can remake the roof, the floor, and your name?